Pas de problème. De toute façon, après, il y a d'autres lectures. Hein. Donc, je m'arrête. Ouais. En effet, je pense que j'irai pas au bout de celle-là et je continuerai la suivante.
Super. Okay, let's start the third lecture of the morning from Patrice. Patrice is from the Contronics group and Cera Saclay. He's going to talk about superconducting qubits, so it might be a bit of topic change from before. So don't hesitate to ask questions during the talk if you want, because we will have to end up sharp at 12:25 to go to lunch. At the end of the session, just go to lunch immediately. Don't go to your room, otherwise you will be late at lunch. And I have something else that I forgot.
Yes. So hello everybody. Thank you to Quentin and to Antoine for organizing this very nice call. Indeed, I'm Patrice Berthet. I work at CA Saclay in the Quantronics group, and our expert.
I just remember what I want to say. All the slides will be online as soon as we get it from the speaker. So probably at the end of the lecture,
Yes, so and I'm going to tell you about superconducting qubits. And indeed, as Quentin says, please interrupt me and ask questions during the talk. Especially, I know it's not necessarily your expertise, what I'm going to talk about. All right, so this field of superconducting quantum circuits is born really, this is a very nice example that, of a field which is born from a very fundamental question that was asked 25 years ago, or maybe a bit more now. I think it's more, maybe 30. And the question is, has to do with the behavior of macroscopic systems such as electrical circuits. So, you know, you can microfabricate electrical circuits, and the question was, can these circuits behave quantum mechanically? And you know, by these macroscopic circuits, I mean systems like this. So you see, this is an example. This is, I will show you later, this is a Josephson junction. And you see how ugly it is? It's not, you know, this is 1 micron long. So it's man-made, it's very ugly. Can this be some truly quantum mechanical system? And so this question was answered positively. So I realized it's in fact 35 years ago, not 25 years ago. In these two pioneering, I mean, the two articles, but there were several others. This was a very small community at the time. And in fact, some of the people who did these experiments in '85, they are still leaders of the field, particularly Michel Devoret and John Martinis and John Clark. So you see, it's, they wrote really the history of this field. And the answer is, okay, yes. In fact, in certain situations, these circuits can behave quantum mechanically. And in particular, it is possible to build electrical circuits that have discrete energy levels exactly like atoms. So there was this starting analogy. If you read this paper, you will see that, I think maybe in this paper, the quality factor of the resonance was maybe 2, right? So it means this discrete energy level had a width that is maybe half of the resonance frequency, right? But this still, it was, you know, and they were happy with that because they had really fundamental questions. But, you know, this started in this way, and now, you know, this whole field evolved by improving to a situation where we really can build circuits that behave as artificial atoms, and we can prepare them in superposition of states. So they have basis states 0 and 1, and we can prepare them in arbitrary superposition of states. And then, you know, you can take several of them because it's on a chip, and you can then perform real experiments of quantum optics and quantum information on a chip. And in particular, you can entangle them, and this is a bit what these lectures are about. And so, yes, and then do quantum physics, quantum algorithms, quantum simulators with that. Right? And now this whole field has evolved to the point that some companies, as you probably know, use this as a platform to build elementary quantum processors. And you even have an elementary IBM quantum machine, which is freely available online. where you have this superconducting processor in IBM Labs, but you can program it from your laptop, and then it will be compiled, and it will be the experiment is going to be run, and the result you will get, right? So this is the outline of these 3 lectures. So today I'm gonna talk about really the basics of qubits. Then in the next lecture I'm gonna focus on readout because it's a very important topic. And in the 3rd lecture I'm gonna talk about applications in quantum computing and also in quantum sensing. And this is maybe more from the perspective of my lab, because in my lab we are more interested in fact in the quantum sensing aspects. All right, so let's start with this. And so I apologize, there's going to be a part of this lecture which is going to be a bit dry, because I want to address a bit the physics of the Josephson junction. So, okay, let's see together how it goes, and you can interrupt me, ask questions, or maybe I will go faster because it's too complicated. Let's see. You can tell, oh, it's too boring. Just move on. Okay, so but let's start. So what I would like to explain you basically is because it's not obvious, right? How it is possible to treat an electrical circuit and to turn it into a quantum mechanical 2-level system. Right? This is my goal, and of course the starting point is, and this is like quite general in this topic, is to start from the simplest electrical circuit. And the simplest circuit is an LC oscillator, right? So I have this inductor, capacitor. It has a natural, it is a resonator. It has a natural resonance frequency, which is omega naught, 1/square root of LC, as you all know. And now to describe, so the question is, okay, how to describe this oscillator quantum mechanically, and this is probably something that you've also seen in your basic quantum mechanics lectures. So first you introduce the variables that you want to quantize, and the dynamic variables of the system. And the good variables for this topic are, on one hand, the flux through an inductor, and this flux is defined as the integral over time of the voltage across the circuit, since minus infinity in time, right? And Q is the charge across stored on the capacitor, and it's the integral since minus infinity of the current running through this circuit. Okay, so these are the 2 dynamic variables that are used to describe, to treat the system. Okay, then we write a Hamiltonian. So, you know, again, I did it already here, but you first write a classical Hamiltonian. The classical Hamiltonian is phi squared divided by 2L plus Q squared divided by 2C. It's the sum of the inductive energy and the charging electrostatic energy, right? And then to quantize this, you put little hats on top of these operators. But you also need the fact that there is a commutation relation between them, and this commutation relation is exactly the analogous of X and P for an electron around an atom, right? And then it's I h bar. So, you know, this looks like an atom. I mean, it has several features, but there is a big difference, is that this energy is harmonic. Right? This is the energy of a harmonic oscillator. And now if you can, now you have all you need to write the energy levels, to compute the energy levels of this system, and you know them. They are like Fock states of this, system, of this harmonic oscillator. The ground state being the Fock state 0, and all the states are separated by h bar omega naught. And here you see that I represent the system. This blue curve is, in a sense, the potential energy of the system, right? And the potential energy I will take as the flux, right? So I take this is for me the potential energy, and this would be the kinetic term in a sense, right? So the capacitor would be the mass, and this is the inductive energy. So this is the potential in which, in a sense, the particle moves. Okay. Right. So you see, okay, so this is true for any LC oscillator, even the one you have in your pocket with your cell phone. So when are we in the quantum regime with such an oscillator? Well, there are two answers for that. First, you know, if you want to be in the quantum regime, it's always nice to start from a pure quantum state, because otherwise it makes no sense. If you have a lot of distribution of the initial state over many, many states, then, you know, quantum fluctuations are irrelevant, right? You are dominated by thermal fluctuations. So you want to be in a regime where at equilibrium, at thermal equilibrium, the system is going to be with high probability in the ground state. And this is, so what is the condition for that? Well, the energy scale is h bar omega naught. So if we want the system to be in the ground state, the thermal fluctuations, kT, should be much smaller than h bar omega naught. So here you must have in mind that, so I do the math for yourself, because otherwise, gigahertz, so 1 gigahertz is 50 millikelvin in temperature. So we work typically with circuits in the 5, 6, 7 gigahertz range. And so this means that they correspond to a temperature of 250 millikelvin, right? So it means that as long as the temperature of the experiment is much smaller than 250 millikelvin, then, you know, the circuit will be in its quantum ground state just by cooling it. There's nothing to do. And so what I didn't write on this slide, but maybe some of you know, is that the tool for that is called a dilution cryostat. A dilution cryostat will just cool your system to 10 millikelvin, right? It's commercial, it's expensive, but it will just do it very simply. So all our experiments are done at 10 millikelvin, right? And this is the reason why. Because we want the quantum state of the circuit to be well defined and to be as close as possible to the ground state when we start the experiment. Right. Another feature is that you want low dissipation. We want circuits that can store, you know, the states for a long time, right? That's kind of obvious. So this translates into we want an LC circuit with a high quality factor. And for that, if you just take any if you just make an LC circuit like that, this is not granted because you will have ohmic losses, in particular in the inductor. So this means, and this is why all these lectures are using superconducting circuits, because superconductivity then you know, suppresses ohmic losses to a large extent. It's not completely true. Huh? It's not, there are still remaining losses, unfortunately, as you will see, but it strongly suppresses the losses, and so you can have very high quality factors in this LC circuit. So, you know, if you just take a superconducting LC circuit and you cool it down to 10 millikelvin, then, you know, you have a perfectly quantized LC oscillator at your hand. So this is, you know, this is how it works. But there is a big difference in this system compared to an atom. Otherwise, it's really electrical analogous. And the difference is that in an atom, there is a source of nonlinearity, and that's the Coulomb interaction. Coulomb interaction is 1 over R, and this is very nonlinear. Here, you see that the potential is perfectly harmonic, so this is very linear. So this means that all levels are equidistant. This is not ideal, because it means that if you start from the ground state, you cannot so easily prepare the system in the ground in the first excited state, for instance. You cannot do this with a classical source, in fact. Because probably, as you all know, so, okay, let me ask a question. So what kind of state do you prepare if you drive with a classical source a system starting from the ground state? Do some of you know it? A coherent state, right? So you prepare the only states that are classically available are coherent states, and coherent states have a well-defined statistics, and one is not a coherent state. This is a Fock state. This is a highly non-classical state. So you cannot prepare it. So this is bad. If you want to use these two levels for a qubit, it's not great. This is why, in addition to this ingredient, so we have this superconducting LC oscillator, but we need an extra ingredient, and this extra ingredient, what we would like is to, you know, to make this circuit really nonlinear. We would like the equivalent of the Coulombic interaction for this circuit. So we want something that's nonlinear and also non-dissipative, because we still want to have the high quality factor. And really the best element, and this is like, you know, in all field of physics, the Josephson junction is just that. This is a magical element that is highly nonlinear and highly non-dissipative. And it's, to my knowledge, is the only one. So, which motivates... Oh, yes. Yes, this is what I said, yes. Coulombic interaction. No, but, okay, you're right. Yes, you're right. But as a device, in the device, as a device level, yes. Okay, so this motivates the discussion of the Josephson effect, and is in a very small nutshell, because it's complicated, and there is little time. And anyway, so let's start with a superconducting electrode. So I need to speak a bit about superconductivity, and like in a super basic way, but you probably all know that superconductivity can be described by one ground state, which is the superconducting ground state, and there is, of course, a myriad, an infinity of excitations that are quasi-particles, but they are protected from the ground state by an energy gap, delta. Right? But there is this unique ground state with a fixed number of Cooper pairs. So you know that the carriers of current in a superconductor are not electrons, they are paired electrons that are called Cooper pairs. Okay. So, okay, we have this unique ground state, and now what is a Josephson junction? A Josephson junction is a combination of two pieces of superconductors separated by an insulating barrier that is just thin enough for Cooper pairs to be able to tunnel from one electrode to the other. So this is called a tunnel junction. So you have two electrodes, and this is an SIS junction because it's superconducting, insulating, superconducting. There is a, you know, like a zoology of different junctions. You can do SNS, you can do whatever. But we are focusing on the SIS. So, you know, now we have these two electrodes. It's still a superconductor, so the total number of Cooper pairs is fixed. Let's call it capital N, but not the difference, because now Cooper pairs can tunnel from one electrode to the other. And so we can define now this little n as the number of pairs having passed through the barrier, right, compared to the reference number, which is arbitrary anyway, but which we can call capital N1, capital N2. And you see that now it's different. We still have this continuum of quasi-particle excitation, but we have many ground states, which are discrete ground states, but which are connected by a tunneling element. We can go from one to the other with a discrete number of this little n. Okay, is this good for everyone? This is our Hilbert space. Okay, now we forget about all the superconducting qubits. We in general forget about the continuum. We work in the coherent ground state manifold, and here, but because of the junction, because Cooper pairs can tunnel, this provides enough degrees of freedom to have, it's still an infinitely large Hilbert space, but which is coherent because it's composed of ground states in which Cooper pairs can that are coupled by some tunneling of Cooper pairs. This is the ground state of all the systems that we're going to consider. And so you can really write then an arbitrary wave function in this Hilbert space. So this wave state vector is going to be an arbitrary superposition of these ground states n. Right? N are the basis states, and on these basis states we have arbitrary states of a junction. Okay. So okay, now this is the Hilbert space, but the Hamiltonian of the Josephson effect. The Josephson effect is the tunneling of Cooper pairs, right? And so it's the Josephson effect is this little arrow between the ground states, and this occurs with a certain energy, right? There is a coupling term in this Hamiltonian, and this coupling term is called EJ. This is the Josephson energy, and so then we have this phenomenological Josephson Hamiltonian, where we call it, okay, so Hj minus Ej over 2, and then it's just the sum, it's just the nearest neighbor coupling of these n states. Okay, so here Ej, in fact, interestingly, is related to macroscopic parameters such as the normal state conductance of the junction. So this formula is exact. So this Hamiltonian is phenomenological, but to derive this equation is also possible. But for that, this is more complicated, so this is not what I'm going to do. But it can be, this Hamiltonian can be rigorously derived from BCS theory of superconductivity together with tunneling of electrons, right? You can compute this process, and this is what Brian Josephson did in the 60s, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. Okay, so we have this Hamiltonian, and now we have a Hamiltonian, so we should diagonalize it, of course. And these are the eigenstates of this Hamiltonian. They are infinite superposition of n with a phase, which is parametrized by a parameter which we can call theta, and theta is called the phase, and these are the phase states, and you see they are generalized eigenstates in the sense that they cannot be normalized. Huh? It's this story. It's the same story as anytime you have an infinite Hilbert space, you run into trouble. It's the same thing with you know, in free space, and so these are the generalized eigenstates, the phase space. So this phase theta is 2 pi periodic, and if you see that theta plus 2 pi is exactly the same state as this one, so we take theta to be between minus pi and pi, and the eigenvalues associated with this space, this state, are minus Ej cos theta. So all right. And just continuing a bit about this Josephson effect. So we can define now operators. We have the Josephson Hamiltonian, but we can define operators in this Hilbert space. The n operator will just be the sum of the n and n, right? And we can define the phase operator, which is going to be the theta. One theta is missing, I'm sorry. The theta. And the current operator is going to be the derivative in time of the charge operator, because it's the number of times the charge 2e. And so these operators are useful, and this is why I have to introduce them. And so what one can show, and so I won't do it in detail by lack of time, but first of all, an important point is that the phase and the charge are two conjugate variables. This you can already guess here, because of course we have these phase states are infinite sum of charge states. So it's again the position and momentum states, right? That are the eigenstates of the respective the potential energy or the kinetic energy in the mechanical oscillator. So here is the same, and they are related by this canonical relation, commutation relation. And then the current, you can, it's possible also to compute it, and then we see that the current applied to the phase states is related, is proportional to the sign of the phase with a coefficient which is called IC. IC is called the critical current of the junction, and it is proportional directly to the Josephson energy with fundamental constants, 2e over h bar. This is called the first Josephson relation. Okay, I'm sorry, it's a bit abstract again, but it will be better soon. Now, there is a second Josephson relation, and this one has to do with the voltage. Consider now that you have this tunnel junction, superconducting tunnel junction, but with a voltage applied in between the electrodes. Now, the electrostatic energy, when you have n Cooper pairs that pass across the barrier, is just clearly the voltage times the charge. So it's minus 2e v times n, right? And so the total junction Hamiltonian is given by this. So you have to add this term to the Josephson Hamiltonian. And then we can derive that the fact that the derivative of the phase operator is actually directly given by the voltage. divided by one parameter, which is called little phi naught. Little phi naught is the h bar divided by 2e, and this is the reduced flux quantum. And I give its value here with a lot of numbers, because you may know that this is a super precise relation. In fact, I think it's a relative accuracy has been checked to 7. So, okay, I don't want to say error, but yes, more than 10 digits. The comparison between, and so this is a relation that links directly the voltage to a frequency. In fact, this is now the basis for the voltage standards, because of course frequencies are controlled very well. These are the quantities in physics that are the easiest to control with metrological accuracy, and this links directly the voltage to a frequency, right? So it's really in megahertz per volt. Right?
So used for the new mass definition.
Yes, now it's part of the whole SI redefinition, right? So yes, absolutely. Yes, and so this relation is of course very important, but it also links you remember we had this. When I introduced the LC oscillator, I said the right dynamic variable is the flux, is the integral of the voltage over time across the inductor. Now it links this flux operator to the phase operator directly. And this is a crucial, you see the phase operator is something microscopic, is the microscopic of the tunnel element, the tunnel junction. But we also need, because we're going to build circuits, right? So we need to link this phase operator to electrodynamic parameters such as voltages, applied fluxes, applied magnetic fields. And this is enabled by this second Josephson relation, that the phase is directly the integral of the voltage. It's not trivial. This is the essence of the second Josephson relation. All right, so you see we have two Josephson relations, so it's interesting to consider them together. So if we take together these two relations, and let's put ourselves in the classical limit. What means the classical limit? It means now I remove the hats, which means that I forget about quantum fluctuations of the phase. You see that here, these parameters, the phase has a hat. What does it mean? It means it has a mean value and fluctuations. Right? This is what quantum mechanics is about. It's a theory of fluctuations, right? But the mean value is the classical number, right? So in some situations, in some states, the fluctuations are negligible for a number of reasons. So you can just consider the mean value. And this is, most junctions are in this limit. So this is called the classical limit of a junction in which the phase is well defined and you take it as just a number. Okay, then we have a relation between the current and the phase. We have a relation between the voltage and the phase. So maybe it's interesting to look at what it gives together. And what it gives is that the voltage is actually proportional to the derivative of the current with a certain term which is called Lj of theta. What does it mean? It means that a Josephson junction, if you just look at it from the perspective of an electrical engineer, is just an inductance. However, it's a very particular inductance because here, this value of the inductance is nonlinear, is highly nonlinear. And this is clear by writing this value. You see that Lj is given by this phi naught. So phi naught is h bar over 2e, right? So it's a fundamental constant. Divided by IC is still a number. It's a parameter, cos theta. But theta is the phase, and the phase is related to the current. So it means that now I can, and cos theta, I can write it as a function of the current using the first Josephson relation. And so I have this relation between voltage and the derivative of the current with an inductance that itself depends on the current. And this is the value of this Josephson inductance. Right? So this is essential. This is the essential part here, is that a Josephson junction is a nonlinear inductance. With an inductance that is inversely proportional to this critical current IC, and which you see that it increases when the current through the junction increases towards the critical current. So you see that I didn't say what happens when the current is above IC In fact, when the current is above IC, all this breaks down because now we generate quasi-particles. So we are no longer in this manifold of ground states. We will go into the continuum of excitations, and then it's another story, right? But this is so do you have questions on that, or is it okay? No? All right. I miss yet two ingredients in my discussion, so, but I'm nearly done on this like dry part. One is the charging energy. So look at this structure. You see that I've very much focused on the tunneling, but you know, if I had shown you without saying that there is a tunneling, you would say, oh, it's a capacitor, right? You have electrodes, an insulator, so it's a capacitor. Yes, it is a capacitor, and this capacitor also has an energy. So every time we have Cooper pairs tunneling through the junction, we are also changing this charging energy, right? We are changing the electrostatic energy of the system. And so this junction has a self-capacitance C, and then there is a kind of the energy scale associated with this charging energy is called the charging energy, and it's given by the charging energy that will the system will undergo when one Cooper pair tunnels. So it's 2E squared divided by 2C. Then we have this total Hamiltonian of the junction, where we have the Josephson term and the charging term. And you see that now if I plot, so the effect of this charging term is that it will change also the energy of the ground states. So there will be some kind of competition between the tunneling and the charging energy. You see that if the charging energy is very small compared to the tunneling, then you will have a physics of like a classical Josephson junction. The tunneling term will dominate. You will go close, very close to well-defined phase states for the eigenstates with little fluctuations. But on the other hand, if we have charging, much larger charging term, then you know, quantum fluctuations are going to play a role. And this is exactly the field of superconducting qubits, is about exploring this competition between charging and Josephson energy in the quantum regime. And so an essential parameter in all these circuits is this ratio EJ over EC. This is kind of like you will see, it comes very often. The last ingredient in my quantum toolbox is the squid. So what is a squid? So to explain what is a squid, I have to start with flux quantization, because probably you are familiar with it. So you know that if I take a thick superconducting loop, then the magnetic flux that goes through the loop is quantized in integer numbers times the flux quantum phi naught. So this is capital phi naught, so it means it's h divided by 2e. It's not h bar, so there is a 2 pi difference, okay? But you know, it's similar, of course. So you know that. Now, this is valid for like a thick superconducting loop. Now, what happens if we make this loop a little bit weaker in some places? And this is what we do, you know, in this circuit. We often have superconducting loops, but they are interrupted by weak links. Weak links, what are weak links? Weak links are Josephson junctions, for instance. So, by the way, little cross means junction. So, this is the universal symbol for Josephson junction, right? Because you can now draw circuits with by putting junctions in a loop, etc. So, for instance, I have this circuit, a loop with 2 junctions and 1 inductance. So, there is the equivalent of this, because you know there is still a loop, so the phase still has to be preserved. And you know that this comes from the fact that the phase has to, that there is no magnetic field inside the superconductor, right? And so that when you can make a closed contour where there is absolutely no magnetic field, and so you can integrate, and then the phase is going to be an integer number of 2 pi. Here you cannot do that because you have weak links. So the field is going to penetrate, but you have the equivalent of that, and the equivalent of that is that there is a relation linking all these fluxes. You see that here flux means integral of the voltage. So the sum of the integral of the voltage across a given loop is quantized, is related to the applied magnetic flux plus an integer number of times the flux quantum. So there is, this is the equivalent of this. So this is called flux quantization or phase quantization, because if I divide by phi naught, this is the sum of phases, right? There is a direct relation between flux and phase. So using this flux quantization relation, it is possible to treat the simplest circuit, which is one of the simplest circuits, which is a loop containing two Josephson junctions. And this is called a squid. And so now I have this squid. I imagine that I have just this loop with two Josephson junctions. I apply a phase phi inside this square area of the squid. And then, so I will not prove it, but you can try to prove that as an assignment, that this circuit actually behaves like a single Josephson junction, but with a critical current that now depends on the applied flux phi, and it depends in this way. It's proportional to the critical current, I C naught, and then there is this cosine dependence of the critical current, right? So we have, so let me summarize. This circuit is equivalent to a single tunable Josephson junction with a critical current that's tunable by the flux. And if you remember, this is also nonlinear inductance with the nonlinearity that depends on the critical current. So you see that you have a lot of tunability and nonlinearity in the Josephson junction by making circuits. And yes.
So there's an absolute value around the cost. You cannot change the sign of the nonlinearity.
Well, no. No, it's yes. No, you can have in some circuits you can explore phases across pi, etc. But it's a bit exotic. Yes, no.
So the analogy most of the time is just repulsive interaction.
Repulsive interaction.
In your nonlinear terms,
yes.
In the Hamiltonian.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yes. It's a curve. The curve is negative. Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah. There was another question I saw. No. No. Let's continue. Okay. So now let's move to the simplest circuit, the qubit circuit, which is the Cooper pair box. And it's the simplest, and it's still the most widely used. So it's really the one to study. Right? And so the Cooper pair box is just a junction, voltage biased. So there is, so in addition to this junction, you see that I also have a gate electrode, and I apply some voltage between the gate electrode and the ground. The gate electrode and yes, the ground that I can take that, right? So this is the electrical schematics. This is the ground. The ground is connected to an island via this junction, and the island is voltage biased by gate voltage, which is called VG, through a gate capacitor, which is called CG. And so I will not, it's possible to derive, so there is a theory that explains how to write the Hamiltonian of an arbitrary circuit. You can combine any number of junctions, inductance, capacitor, and you can write the Hamiltonian. There is a well-defined like procedure that is based on Kirchhoff law, basically for circuits, in the quantum version. So I've done it for you, and this is the Hamiltonian of the Cooper pair that you find if you do that. And so you see that again we have this charging energy of the junction and the Josephson energy that enter, and there is another parameter which is the gate charge. Gate charge is the voltage applied to the gate multiplied by CG to make it turn it into a charge and divided by 2E. And so this is the Hamiltonian, and so this is now tunable. This VG can be tuned, right? And you can make it even more tunable by turning the junction into a loop, because then, as I said, you have two junctions. So this is a squid, and then a squid is like a tunable Josephson junction. So then you have this even EJ becomes tunable in flux. So you can tune. It's very convenient. All right. So now we have a Hamiltonian, and so I want to do this really to show you that it's possible to compute things. This is not just hand waving. This is, you have a Hamiltonian, and you can solve, you can diagonalize this Hamiltonian. Again, the variables are n and theta, and we are looking for, you know, energy eigenstates that are sums of the charge states, and you know, you can write this. Now this Hamiltonian, again, this is the tunneling Hamiltonian in the charge basis, right? And this is the matrix that you have to diagonalize. It's very simple, in fact, because you see that on the diagonal you have the electrostatic terms, on the off diagonal you have the Josephson terms, and then you can just diagonalize it. But you can also do this in the phase basis. As I said, you have conjugate variables. You can write it either in the charge or in the phase variable. It's exactly like a mechanical oscillator. And then we would look for wave state vectors that are sums of the charge states with a charge wave function that lives between 0 and 2 pi, right? And in the phase, now we have a differential equation that is now, you know, continuous, and this is it gives rise to the Mathieu equation. And you can look for the solution of the Mathieu equation. Even in Mathematica, this is it's not analytical, but yes. So let's look. Now I will show you examples, and I will try to give you some intuition of how it works in you know, in practical cases. So the first case to consider is the case where the Josephson energy is negligible, is very small compared to EC, because to gain intuition it's interesting. And even let's consider the case where the Josephson energy is 0, right? Then the eigenstates, quite logically, are entirely defined by the electrostatic interaction, and because we have discrete charge states. So first, what is the energy of the n equals 0 as a function of ng? Well, you know, when ng equals 0, energy is 0, and then when we apply a voltage on the gate, we are increasing the energy of this state, right? And then we have this parabolic dependence, right? So this state, this is the energy dispersion of this state. But if I start with one Cooper pair on the island, if I apply 0 voltage, then you know, this is centered on ng equals 1, right? Because when I apply, right, if I apply, if I have one Cooper pair, then I have to apply one voltage charge to minimize the energy, right? In terms of reduced units, ng equals 1, right? Because it's the difference, n minus ng. Right? So we have this family of parabola for all the charge states. And they cross, but nothing happens at the crossings, right? Because there is no coupling between these states. And the eigenstates are obviously well-defined charge states. And in the phase basis, the phase is completely delocalized. Okay, let's turn a little bit of Josephson energy. Well, then we can diagonalize again the Hamiltonian, and this is what we find. And now we see that there is a coupling. The Josephson term induces coupling between these charge states. So it means that, and when the energy of these states coincides, then there is tunneling that is possible, and we open a gap. So now it means that we have one ground state, one first excited state, and we may have transitions between the two. And this is a possible qubit. This is how we can get. And you see that this is very nonlinear. If I sit here, in particular, this energy between the two states is very different from the second excited state. So this is a possible qubit. So this is the Cooper pair box, and I can keep computing the energy eigenstates in the charge basis, for instance. And you know, of course, here, for instance, if I sit here, the first two eigenstates are still very close to just a very localized charge at 0 and a very localized charge at 1, right? And now if I look at the phase, there is a small oscillation. But if I sit at ng equals 0.5, now you see that we have the energy eigenstates are sums coherent superpositions of 0 and 1 charge states with positive and symmetric and anti-symmetric combinations. And this is clearly reminiscent of the physics of two-level tunneling, right? Two-level system with tunneling. And this is exactly what it is. Yes.
Quick question on that. Like, practically, how do you create? So you have to create if you want to initialize the qubits in this state,
yes,
to create this coherent superposition of 0 and 1 in the charge.
Okay, so let's answer this question. So I'm asking you, how do I initialize the system into this state?
Good strategy.
Go on. Yes. 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 So in a sense, so yes, NG is a parameter that I control, right? I control the gate voltage. So I have my circuit. I'm fabricating my circuit, and now NG is a voltage, so I can tune this voltage here. Yes. And but how do I initialize it into this state? This is the ground state of the system. So, at thermal equilibrium, the system is in this state, right? So you don't have to create it. In a sense, this is the energy eigenstate. Now, I rewrite it as a coherent superposition because I know that there are charge states underlying, but in reality, if I would write it in a different basis, in the energy basis, this is the ground state.
So there's no constraint on the at which speed you ramp up NG to
No. Well, there is clearly a constraint. So here you would ramp up. You should stay in the adiabatic, right? Imagine you start at NG equals 0, and you want to go here. So what is the thing that you should not do? Is to apply NG in a time scale which is much shorter than this energy scale, right? This is the adiabatic limit. But in general, this is like 5 gigahertz. In fact, no, it's more interesting than that because the first experiment was done exactly like that. You can, maybe you want to do this because if you want to see oscillations between these two states. So if you want to do oscillations, this is exactly what you should do. You should start from NG equals 0. You should apply a super fast pulse, like, few tens of picoseconds rise time to go here. Then you would have your system oscillate, and then you can come back. This is a super hard experiment. But it was the first that was done in the field, interestingly.
Can you not just reduce the gap open? Like if you reduce
yes, you can do that also, but in a sense, it's more. Yes, you can do it. Yes, you can also do it. But in fact, now the modern way, is you just tune your gate voltage quietly, and then you apply microwave drive, right? You can also do this. This is the modern way. Right. So now you see that. So it's interesting to explore a bit how the system evolves in terms of this ratio EJ over EC. So this is, okay, 0.5. You see that these bands, now we are losing a little bit this kind of avoided level crossing feature that was interesting for the intuition, but the bands are becoming flatter and flatter, 2 and, 5 and 10. And now you see that if I plot the energy levels as a function of NG, it's just flat in this large EJ over EC ratio. But in fact, it is still a qubit. And for many reasons that I'm going to explain, this is the modern Cooper pair box. So all modern Cooper pair boxes are used in this regime, not in the first regime that I explained, just to give you the physics of the circuit. So the field started so the whole superconducting qubit story started in this regime, but now it very quickly evolved through this regime. This is now the modern regime, and this is what is used in all labs in the world, right? And I will explain why. So this regime is called the Transmont qubit. So Transmont qubit is just one Cooper pair box in this large EJ over EC regime, and it was proposed in this paper. And you see that now if I plot the eigenstates in the charge basis, it's a coherent superposition of many charge states, right? And the phase, on the other hand, is more and more, is better and better defined. Still, it has appreciable quantum fluctuations, right? But in a sense, you see that now the eigenstates are like this. And there is still an anharmonicity. In fact, the anharmonicity becomes smaller, but there is still a difference between these two levels. And it's not enormous, but it's sufficient to have a qubit. And you see that here the eigenstates, they look a little bit like eigenstates of a harmonic oscillator, in fact. Because if I look at the ground state, this is a Gaussian in the phase state. And now in the first excited state, I have this like feature at 0, so with these two lobes. And now if you plot, these are the higher and higher energy states. And so this is becoming closer and closer to a harmonic oscillator. And there is a good reason for that. The good reason is that, remember that we have this potential energy profile, right? And what we said so far is that this EJ, the phase term defines the potential energy, and the electrostatic term is the kinetic energy. And so now we have a regime in which the kinetic energy is much smaller. The kinetic term is smaller than the potential energy. So in fact, there are many levels in the well. If I plot the potential energy as a function of the phase, there is this sinusoidal potential. And now I have many levels in the well. So in fact, I can approximate for the lowest energy levels. You see that it's not so different from a parabola. And this is why the eigenstates are so close. But still, it's appreciably different, because there is still some nonlinear term that comes from the fact that it's not a parabola, it's a sine curve. And so the second excited state feels this little anharmonicity, and its energy is just lower by what is sufficient to have an anharmonic system. This is the physics of the transmon, and this can be, turned into it's a simplified model in which you just completely get rid of the NG term, and you just treat it as an anharmonic oscillator with a weak anharmonicity, and then you can do perturbation theory, and you have approximate formulas for the anharmonicity. The anharmonicity, it turns out, is given by the charging energy. It's just a detail, but you see this is the. But what's interesting is that then you have some interesting aspects about the Fock, the energy states. They are well approximated by Fock states of a harmonic oscillator, and also on the transition that are possible between these states.
Where does the name come from? Transmon?
The name was very badly chosen. So, the story is like that. So I think there was a confusion on this. So. The name was given by Rob Schulkopf at Yale because they started doing so this Cooper pair box in his experiment, I will talk about that in the next lecture. They are coupled to a transmission line resonator, but all qubits can be coupled to a transmission line resonator. This has nothing to do with this, and so yes, I think it's a bad name, but it stayed right. Okay, so just to show you that it works. This is the experimental spectrum of a transmon qubit. So starting from the ground state, I will explain in the next lecture how this is measured, but starting from the ground state, you see that at low power you have one peak that appears. This is the first excited state. Then if you crank up the power of the microwave, you will see that this peak is broadened. This is power broadening, but there is an extra peak appearing. This is two-level transition from the ground to the second excited state. And the blue curve is the spectroscopy conditioned to the fact that the system has been excited in the first excited state, and then you see only the second peak. Okay? This is all consistent. You mean? Okay, so because here we have cranked up the power. So when you increase the power on the two-level system, you will broaden the peak, right? This is called power broadening because you increase the Rabi oscillation, and so you have power broadening of the peak. The width of this peak here, you see here in the first curve was taken at very low power, so then here the width that you see is probably the natural line width of the transition. However, when you increase the power, the line width becomes the Rabi frequency, okay? And this is proportional to the amplitude that you use. So this is why it's broadened. Okay? So, well, precisely how, so okay, we have this qubit now. How do we use it? Well, we want to apply gates. We want to manipulate the quantum state of the qubit. And so for that, you will apply a microwave drive, right? So this is the Cooper pair box. You still, you have the island. This is the ground. It's connected by a capacitor, a junction, and it's connected to a gate voltage via this capacitor. But here we apply a microwave drive, delta ng cos omega t. And if you put this in the Hamiltonian and you do just expansion of this Hamiltonian, you will recover the Transmon Hamiltonian. So you see that I have. Remember that here this is a circuit, right? So it still has an infinite number of energy levels. So when you have that, but when you want to do to treat it as a qubit, what you do is a two-level approximation. So you take this very complicated operator and you just project it on the two lowest energy states. And you express this in the basis 0, 1. Then evidently the Hamiltonian of the two-level system becomes minus h bar omega divided by 2 sigma z. This is a generic feature. It has nothing to do with superconducting circuits. Any two-level system that you consider, the free Hamiltonian is always that, right? Because it just means that there is omega, h bar omega between the ground state and the excited state. This is all it means, right? Okay, but now you have this term and this drive term. You will also project it on these two levels. And then the drive term, it turns out that this operator is proportional to sigma y. So you have a two-level free operator and a drive which is proportional to a Pauli matrix. So we are, you know, this is two-level system. This is NMR. This is spin half physics driven by some oscillating field, right? So what is the Rabi frequency? Rabi frequency is proportional to the amplitude of the drive. This is always the case, and to the matrix element between ground state and excited state. And the matrix element is the analogy of the dipole. So this, the dipole for a two-level circuit is the matrix element of the charge operator between state 0 and state 1. Okay? And with that, you can do any rotations you want on the Bloch sphere, because, okay, you can apply one pulse, but then you can apply, you know, you can apply another, sorry, yes, oops, yes. So if you apply one pulse with variable times, you will see oscillations. These are Rabi oscillations. And if you want to do rotations on the Bloch sphere with a different phase with respect to the first pulse, you just change the phase of the microwave, right? Another option is to apply some flux pulse. In this way, you will, the qubit is going to be detuned, and then this detuning amounts to a rotation around the z-axis of the Bloch sphere. If you are not familiar with that, maybe you can ask questions about that. But this is the Bloch sphere picture. And fidelity of these rotations now is performed with, like, we should stop speaking of fidelity and speak of error rate. It's much, you know, instead of piling up nines, right? The error rate is below 10 to minus 3 nowadays. Okay, just a few words on decoherence, because this is the crucial thing that actually is a crucial problem to solve for quantum computing, as you may know. And so where does decoherence come from in this system? So I said, in a sense, the coherence comes from superconductivity and the Josephson effect, right? But the decoherence comes from the uncontrolled terms in the Hamiltonian parameters. And this is a solid state system, so it's rather strongly coupled to its environment. And so, you know, in a sense, so first of all, you are probably familiar that you have two types of decoherence, right? You can have energy relaxation, in which the system loses a quantum of energy which is absorbed in the environment. The environment has many degrees of freedom, so it will absorb this quantum of energy. This is associated with T1 time, right? And then there is another parameter which describes the dephasing of a superposition of states. How long does superposition alpha 0 plus beta 1 keeps its phase constant and well controlled, and this is called dephasing. And dephasing is associated with a time T2, and in atomic physics, these guys are never interested in dephasing, because it's just, in their case, it's always of radiative origin, meaning that the dominant term is the spontaneous emission, and the loss of phase comes from the spontaneous emission. Right? In solid-state physics, it's very rarely the case, in fact, because, well, there is spontaneous emission, but the loss of phase due to interaction with microscopic noise is in general even stronger, because the parameters of the Hamiltonian have slow fluctuations, they are uncontrolled, and in general they can have, and they are low frequency noise, they often have a 1/f spectrum, and they come from really microscopic noise. So this gives rise to a pure dephasing component, which can be strong also. All right, so now having said that, you know, there is maybe 20 years of research in this decoherence of superconducting qubits. So now the picture is pretty clear. Not everything is understood, but there is a number of things that are understood. So the first thing that people thought at the beginning is, oh yes, of course, so we should be very careful of the electromagnetic noise, right? Because this circuit is coupled to resistors, we have a measurement line, we have resistors, etc. And so there is, resistors have noise. All this, on the circuit, the qubit, everything is non-dissipative. But you always are coupled to resistors because you need to measure your qubit or to drive it. So then this, you know, Johnson-Nyquist fluctuations, they will couple to the circuit. And this Johnson-Nyquist noise at high frequency is the equivalent of spontaneous emission, because if you don't have the thermal noise, even the quantum fluctuations, as you know, radiative relaxation of an atom can be seen as being driven by quantum fluctuations of the field, right? This is true in atomic physics. This is true here also. But this is under control. You can compute it. So it's easy to just design the circuit so that this will not be the dominant contribution. So now this is pretty much under control. The problem is that this is not the whole story. There are also microscopic sources of this noise. And now it's not, I mean, at the beginning it was a question, what will limit? Now we are absolutely in this situation that this is the limiting factor for superconducting qubits. And first aspect is that in the microscopic domain, you can think of, you know, electrons moving around. This is a circuit. There are oxides, there are insulators. And so you can have charges that are trapped in the substrate and that move. So this creates noise. That will couple to the charge degree of freedom. You can also have spins that are flipping, and this will couple to the flux, and then also to the phase. So this flux noise and charge noise are relevant. So the one very important take-home message is that it turns out that charge noise is much, 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 much stronger than flux noise, but very much. In reduced units, it's in fact 3 to 6 orders of magnitude larger. They all have 1/f spectrum, but flux noise is much, much weaker. This is why, if you remember, the Cooper pair box was very sensitive to the charge applied. The energy spectrum was strongly dependent on the charge. This is why these Cooper pair box in the charge regime were in the few nanosecond coherence time, and the Transmont regime, in the Transmont regime, we completely eliminate this NG dependence, and this is why now the charge noise in a Transmont is completely negligible. It would limit the coherence time to several tens of milliseconds. That's just by changing the parameters of the circuit. However, flux noise is there, and it's a limitation in all the circuits, and it limits T2 to 1/200 microseconds in circuits that have flux tunability. If you don't have flux tunability, then it's no problem. Right? Then there are also imperfect dielectrics that cause microwave losses. There are magnetic vortices trapped in the superconducting thin films, and there are unpaired electrons in the superconductors. And these are the three sources causing the high-frequency noise, or the finite T1. This is now well established. And so just a few, and I will stop here, just a few slides to show you that the first experiment by Yasu Nakamura in '99 was exactly along this idea that you start in the Cooper pair box and you move very fast on this with like these picosecond pulses to observe the oscillations between the two states. So this was it's still maybe the most difficult experiment to do, but it was the first one. But here the T2 is like in the nanosecond range because you know, it's a highly charged coupled device. Then the next step was in 2002, in fact, in my laboratory at CEA-Saclay, the quantronium experiment where the T2 suddenly jumped to 500 nanoseconds, and this was really a very important breakthrough. And since then, the field has exploded, and in recent years, progress, this is from 2013, where T1 was in already a few tens of microseconds now, by better control, better design of the qubits, and also a T2 between 1 and 30 microseconds. And this year, there was again a breakthrough by better material with now T1 in the 300 microseconds regime. So it's progressing. It's not progressing so fast as it used to progress, right? Because now it's becoming difficult. There is an enormous community, enormous amount of money which is dedicated to improving these factors. But I would still say that the ultimate limits on coherence times are unknown. And I will stop the lecture with this remark.
Thank you very much. Any questions on this lecture?
Maybe a more engineering-oriented question. How do you, is there several definition of fidelity, or how do you measure the, let's say, the greatness of the information processing?
Oh, yes, I was about to say I will come to that in the third lecture, but I will not come to that because I will not speak about that. There are various measures. Yes, it's the error rate. You want to do some well-defined operation, and how much you miss it. It's easy. Then you have many mathematical definitions, and maybe people have preferences. Fidelity is basically the overlap of the state that you want to achieve compared to the state that you achieve, but this requires tomography. So in general, people, so to quantify, okay, what I can tell you is that to quantify the error rate, the established method is called randomized benchmarking. And it's, the idea is that you just pile up, you define just maybe 3 operations, like these Clifford operations, and you pile up like many of them, and you look at the error rate as a function, at the final success rate as a function of the number of operations, and then you can extract some error per gate. That's, yes, it's a whole business of, yes. And you can do that also for 2 qubits, yes.
In the coherence times business, so you say it's just like a material science now?
And now I would say yes. It's no. So okay, every progress, but really nowadays the quality of the fabrication, the quality of the materials, the oxides, because a lot of the problems come from dielectric losses. So dielectrics should be insulating; they should not absorb microwaves, but they are imperfect. So really, a large part of the field is about finding the best dielectrics and the best material that minimize the microwave losses, but to a level that has never been really looked, and in a regime of single photon that has also never been investigated. So this is a whole field. And for instance, you see in this paper, they realized that by using tantalum instead of aluminum or niobium, they had better results. And probably because, tantalum makes a better oxide or no oxide, or oxidizes less, or something like that. Not really, no. I mean, it's not clear, really. So, and this is, in fact, one of the big surprises of this field is that you can actually do this. Because at the beginning, people would say, but in the Hamiltonian, so far I've said the junction is really non-dissipative. But this sounds too good to be true, but it actually is true to a very, very high level, because, this is a Q of, this is 10 to the 7 or something like that. So never, I mean, people never have thought that this is actually true, that the Hamiltonian, the Josephson Hamiltonian is true to that level. Maybe, they would say, we are missing some intrinsic dissipative term. And there were stories of dissipative terms in there were proposals, etc. But so far it's not, you can control to this level and maybe beyond. Then now, people start to see, like, the more you go to higher limits, the more difficult it becomes. For instance, now it becomes clear that cosmic radiation has an impact. because cosmic radiation creates phonons in the substrate. The high energy phonons are absorbed by the field, create quasi-particles and quasi-particles in T1. So now this has been observed, but it's still a bit above, but very soon we're gonna meet that limit. And then, you know, you will need to do, to go to Modan or whatever to do, I mean, it's, yes. It's
what do you mean when you say we can get good engineering of the like we can get rid of quantum noise by good engineering of the circuit?
Yes, so this part, you mean the electromagnetic part?
Yes.
Well, in the sense that you can compute, this is not too difficult to compute, especially as I will explain in the second lecture. Now, modern experiments, it depends very much on the way you measure the circuit. The circuit is interfaced with the environment. And now this interfacing, there are tools that are very good for that and very simple. So in fact, the interfacing, so it's a little spoiler for the next lecture, which is tomorrow, so it's fine, is that the interfacing is done with microwave resonators. And this is done like that since 2005. This was a big breakthrough. And since then, it has made everything much simpler. And so the control of the electromagnetic environment, I would say, is possible to a high level. Yes. Thanks to the cavities. And yes, it's just basically microwave engineering.
No, Antoine said no more questions. So let's go for lunch and thank the speaker of the morning.
Ouais.